Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you coming out today, especially for a panel on such an important topic. We have 4 great leaders here today, and actually, a 5th person on the panel, Frida, was unable to make it. Frida, who's the CEO of Pymetrics, but she has sent in a really eloquent statement that I'm going to read later. As all of you know, algorithms, machine learning, AI are becoming more and more embedded in education technology products, in fact, in all products across the world that we're all leveraging these days. And so we have a lively topic to discuss here about what it's going to take to get to a world of ethical AI, how all of you think about it for your companies, how should regulators think about it from a government level, and then how should we as an economy of partners to districts, colleges, teachers, students, how should we think about it collectively as a group as we're trying to move the whole society forward. So first what we're going to do is go across and each of you just talk a little bit about in your company, how do you already use algorithms, machine learning, and AI in your products and try to distinguish a little bit between those. And then we're going to get into the ethical discussion as we go. So turn it over first to you.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Drew Magliazzi, CEO of Mainstay, formerly AdmitHub. And we use conversational AI to support people on the journey through college and career. And the way we use AI, typically, algorithms first, to help understand what messages to send people at the pivotal times based on the data that we observe in systems at schools or applicant tracking systems. And then from that, we start a conversation. And there we use conversational AI or natural language processing to understand what people tell us so we can respond most appropriately. And we believe that the AI we use in conversation intelligence is just the baseline. Yes, it needs to be intelligent, it needs to know the right answer, but oftentimes people need more than an answer. The right response can also be a follow-up question. So building not only AI with IQ, but also EQ, empathy and equity, and at times also following up with precise data relevant to that individual, so context and community, or what we call CQ, are also important. So I think AI that is merely intelligent is just scratching the surface of what is possible. So thank you.
Great.
My name's Sergey. Just recently left Turnitin, where I was heading up AI for STEM solutions. And I came to Turnitin by acquisition of a company I co-founded called Gradescope, where we developed AI-assisted grading of all kinds of exams, homework, programming projects, usually at the higher ed level, but also in K through 12. And the way we use AI is for assistance of the instructor. So nothing facing the student, at least not yet, but a lightweight AI assistant for the instructor to grade faster while still being as accurate and as multidimensional as they want to be, so they can use the rubric they want. We just try to speed them up by, for example, grouping answers together. Excited to be here.
Great.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aura Tanner, and I'm one of the co-founders and chief learning officer at the AI Education Project. Mine is slightly different. At my organization, it's a 501c3, where we are teaching students about how AI and machine learning are being used in jobs in everything from fashion design and firefighting to psychology and self-driving cars. So pretty much across a bunch of different careers. Right now there's over 30 different careers that we use to teach students, and we're focused on the untapped communities who normally don't have access to this information, technological education about AI. And so we're trying to make sure that these communities are prepared for what AI is doing as far as automation, and also how they can prepare for the future of work.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Yair Shapira. I'm the founder and CEO of Amplio. we are providing a digital platform, AI-based, for students with special needs. Just to give you a bit of context, between 15 and 25% of the total student enrollment have special needs, starting from learning disabilities like dyslexia and dyscalculia, through speech and language, whether it's language delays or articulation or stuttering like my son has, autism, social and emotional disturbances, and others. Using AI, what we are doing is that our system enables them to progress faster, sometimes 10x faster instead of 4 years, 4 months, to boost the time in teaching for teachers, 3.3x, so have more time with the kids. And we do it using AI and ML and NLP, machine learning and natural language processing. And why am I throwing those acronyms at you? Because special education is very different from general education. General education assumes that kids move in cohorts, in classes, and then you can have a curriculum, which is a one-size-fits-all, and you can have an LMS, right? This doesn't apply to special education. They truly are special, and every child is unique. I mean, how can you put a child who has a lisp with a child who has ADHD, with a child who has autism in the same class and assume that something will happen? And we're using AI, ML, and NLP to personalize, because that's what AI does. Just think, when we go to CNN.com, we see exactly the same page. But when we go to Facebook.com, it's hyper-personalized, and we see different feeds. So we use the same technology to apply concepts like adaptive learning and blended learning and curricula and so on to this untapped world of special education, and that's how we use it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's a good job of explaining how AI can be used for good in your company. You glossed over it a little bit. Tell me why AI is improving, or how it's improving college outcomes in your description.
Thanks, Jason, for calling me out. Yeah, our goal is to drive the outcomes that matter most in the journey through college and career, obviously by providing greater leverage for the counselors that are doing the great work every day in schools. So what we try to do is amplify the communication between students in a one-to-one personalized way, like a great counselor would if they had infinite time. And then we can typically automate about 98 to 99% of that conversation. There's still a large portion, that 1 to 2%, that we identify, which are the highest leverage and frankly most time-consuming things for a counselor that is the machine is frankly inequipped to do, to handle, but a person can dive deeply and support. And sometimes those things take 50% of the time. And in many cases, we're also helping find more of those diamonds in the rough moment while we automate away the tier 1 and tier 2 support things so we can drive the outcomes that matter. Mm-hmm. So thanks, Jason.
Okay. Just briefly for all of you, not to respond verbally, but just by head nods so I can see where you're at. It seems like each of you have implemented AI in a way that is kind of allowing users to augment it's like recommendations as opposed to taking over whole jobs. Or is that not fair? Do you feel like it's actually taking jobs from humans and doing those jobs more efficiently and better?
In our curriculum, we try to take, I'll say, a balanced approach. So there is a lot of hype around AI, and we want to get that out to students. And we also don't want them to, fall prey to the kind of fear-mongering that's done in a lot of the headlines. So yes, we focus on teaching them about job task. So it's very unlikely that entire, jobs from beginning to end will be automated. So we show them what AI is good at some things, but humans are best at some things. And so how do you leverage yourself so that you can start thinking differently about these? And then just also letting them know, while yes, many jobs and job tasks will be automated, there will be a net gain. And there will also be new types of jobs. And even the existing jobs will be done in a different way. So we try to get them to imagine how they can do these jobs in a different way.
And in our case, we do not take jobs, but we do take tasks. So when you look, for example, on speech-language pathologists, out of 40 hours a week that they're getting paid for, how many hours do you think they spend with kids? Make a guess. The answer is somewhere between 6 and 8. So 15% of the time they spend with kids, and everything else is a lot of professional work and very hard work. A lot of it has to do with documentation, administration, meetings, and so on. That's pure overhead. That's not what they signed up for. And we're able to automate most of it. So instead of 15%, we increase it to 67%. Just imagine what you can do when you have 3.3 times more to spend with kids. Add to that the fact that learning processes have to do a lot with repetitions. With intensity of repetitions. Now, when you're a teacher and you are flooded with compliance and regulation and groups of 6 kids who are not even homogeneous, how can you even have time to get those repetitions? This is what a smart system can do. A smart system can be sort of an extension of a teacher and repeat it smartly with students and listen to them and understand what they're saying or what they're writing and provide feedback. So we take these tasks and we augment it, and then we let those clinicians do what they signed up for, what they're best at, which is taking data-driven, evidence-based decisions based on the data that we collect.
Okay, so let's hold there for a second. That's about 10 minutes on the positive case for AI, I would say, so that it's augmenting people to do their jobs better. It's removing the compliance tasks that weren't really adding any value anyway. It's doing things faster, better, cheaper. So that's the positive version. So how about the inequities that might result, or that we're magnifying inequities of the past and now making them automated and not even addressable because there might be a black box in there that people don't understand. How does that actually come up in your company's daily work, where you say, maybe we shouldn't use an algorithm there, maybe we should actually have the 2% you were talking about? And Sergey, I'll start with you. You've had a couple different companies here. How do you think about ethical AI? When does it come up in the product development or deployment process?
We're very careful to only deploy things that we think are not harmful, right, and actually add value to the instructors. So we have high internal, bars for shipping features. And the way we verify that a feature is helpful is just to gather a lot of data and make sure that, there's different gradations of mistakes, right? So if let's say we have a handwriting recognition system and it just misreads something that the student wrote, but the instructor's still going to read it themselves and they can fix that. That's not as bad as, for example, if some other system gave one student access to another student's work, right? Like something they weren't even supposed to have. So we're much more careful in situations where the consequence of a mistake is greater, and we're a little looser if the consequence is not so bad. And I think that's a general framework that's very helpful, right? Like for self-driving cars, if it makes a mistake, someone can easily die. But for Siri, right, on my phone, if it makes a mistake, I can just fix it, right? It's not such a big deal. So when we talk about ethical AI, we have to really think about the application and the consequences of a mistake. And it's a different ethical standard based on that. So that's the first thing we keep in mind. And the second thing we're really conscious of is the data. So the data belongs to our users. If they delete data for whatever reason, we delete it from our systems and we retrain our AI models to exclude that data. And we design some parts of our system from the beginning with that as a design goal, because we think that's the right thing to do. Is if the data disappears in some raw form, then the machine learning model must also lose access to that data, and it shouldn't just retain some memory of it.
Yeah, so we actually see AI as a path to equity. Because in area, at least in our world, in special education, there is a high correlation between disadvantaged populations and the frequency of special education students. So whereas Title I students are 30% overall, in special education they are 50%. And then you want to give them access to smarter, more impactful solutions. So I'll give you one example. In the state of Texas has selected Amplio as a digital dyslexia solution for both English speakers and Spanish speakers. So we have a Spanish digitized curriculum for this population, which suffers more than the English speakers because there are just not that many bilingual reading specialists in the state of Texas. So we actually think it boosts equity rather than creates a problem.
Did you actually study it, or is it more a matter of you think it boosts equity?
I think in our case, it boosts equity. Kids who did not have access, kids who are bilingual and did not have access to a Spanish curriculum, and when you are dyslexic, you need to learn to read in your own language. We do the same in the state of Hawaii with their own languages. And where you don't have access to such a solution, you get inferior than others. So it only increases the gaps, and we decrease the gaps.
Okay, so the assumption is if there's access where before there was no access, it must be better. Or in your work, it almost seems like there's an assumption that AI is going to be coming and permeating in everything that we do. All jobs are going to change. Some jobs are going to go away. Do you think that AI should be regulated in some way, or should it be kind of self-regulated by industry?
I look at things just because we're coming from the more educational aspect. So I think the ethics, if you want to call it, of AI should be built in at the design phase. So really like ethical design, because we are increasingly seeing more and more incidents of bias, and kind of to what Sergey was saying, with the example with Alexa, it might not seem as harmful to some groups as others, but there are huge problems with Alexa and Siri recognizing different accents, especially on the continent of Africa. And that might seem small, but that means that's a whole bunch of people that are not having access to this technology.
It's a whole continent, so
Yeah.
it's not small.
And you would think, like, hey, let's go back and invite these people to be a part of what we're designing so that it can be fixed. But no, to this day, like today, August 10th, it's still not fixed, and there's still issues. So I just think at the like at several points, like the design, the implementation, and the deployment, there just needs to be more diversity of not just race or gender, but cognitive diversity, and always including the people through the whole process of whatever you're building.
So you're talking about sort of design principles that have the ethics built in.
Yeah, instead of doing it, then it gets out there and you're like, oh no, this messed up. When if you were intentional on the front end, I think a lot of this bias would be eliminated.
Okay.
Hell yes. Not only on the engineering side, but also on the data labeling side, because whatever model you train is going to inherit the characteristics of the data that it's learned from. And there have been huge problems seen in like amidst and various data sets that if you inspect them, they're so voluminous, but if you peel back the layers, you can say, oh, these are problematic, and the humans either made mistakes or carried their tremendous bias into the process. And it's oftentimes just lost in the mix and then gets inherited by the machine. In many cases, I say you're not buying AI, you're hiring it, and I think there's a question of if you're hiring it, you got to look to the creators who built it, because it is inheriting a lot from them. And in addition, everyone is biased. I think the challenge we face is not eliminating bias, but frankly scrutinizing it. And bias is not necessarily bad in and of itself, just unexamined bias is bad. And if you truly understand the ways in which a machine learning model is biased and people are biased, you can actually create great things. Do you mind if I share an example from healthcare? There's a model in healthcare that analyzed radiology images, mammograms, to determine whether cancer was present and surgery was necessary. And they trained an AI model, and after scrutinizing it, it turned out it was biased in favor of false negatives, basically, saying there was no cancer present when it actually was. When they scrutinized the data on the doctors, actually they were biased in the opposite direction. They were tended to opt toward doing surgery when actually there was no cancer present. And so knowing the bias of both, actually a combined usage and focusing on the areas of disagreement between the machine learning and the people actually made both able to improve and make better decisions. I think there's an area, the most interesting area of AI is not the pure science of it, but the user experience and how people and AI truly collaborate in a deep way to make each other better. I think that is one of the richest areas for scientific discovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Mm-hmm. And that brought to mind, so these large language models that are in use now, they basically get trained on a large corpus of internet text, so like all of Reddit, and then a bunch of, all of Wikipedia, and then just a sampling of pages on the internet. And they learn to identify enough patterns in the language that they can basically produce, realistic text. You might have seen like GPT-3 and stuff like that. And the danger with that is that if you just let it kind of speak, right, if you ask it some questions that might have unsavory answers, it might well produce unsavory answers because that's what's prevalent, or not necessarily prevalent, but just present in the data that it learned from. So one solution to it could be to sanitize the data set, right? Well, we're just going to remove all slurs from the corpus that it's going to be trained on, and we're really going to examine the data that it's going to be trained on to make sure that it doesn't learn anything that we don't want it to produce. And that might be a solution for one application, but let's say you're training this language model to actually identify hateful text, right? To be, to be part of Facebook, right, where it can identify, automatically flag potentially hateful posts. Well, if that's the application, then you should not sanitize the data, because then it won't be able to recognize hateful text because you just removed all of it from the data. So it's just an example of there actually being some value, right, in the fact that the data is biased. We just have to be thoughtful about how it's going to be applied. Like you were saying, like if we're going to be applying just the model is going to be parroting back whatever's in the data, then we should probably sanitize the data. But if the model is going to be doing something different, then maybe we shouldn't sanitize the data.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I add one more thing, Jason?
No, just hold that thought for one sec. I promise we'll come back to it. I want to get Frida's comment in here. So that's a couple different interesting ideas there. So we've got possible design principles that could be adopted by companies in implementing AI in their companies. We've got possible best practices about data quality going in. Rita's idea is quite interesting, I think. So I just want to read it verbatim. What we need to have is emissions testing for algorithms. Understand the outputs, not how the machine works. We don't necessarily need to understand how a car engine is built to understand if it passes emissions testing, and the same is true for AI and algorithms. We need to move away from seeking to understand every detail of how AI is built and focus on the outputs. We need to invent emissions testing for AI. In the hiring space, Frida is the CEO of a company called Pymetrics that helps analyze thousands of resumes for who should get invited to interviews for jobs, and you can see how bias could possibly crop up in that system. In the hiring space, emissions testing for algorithms would involve testing for gender and racial bias and comparing it to analog processes, kind of like you were talking about. How to do this type of testing, which is known as disparate impact testing, is clearly defined in the hiring space by federal regulations. Those types of regulations may not exist in K-12 or higher ed yet. We should be pushing for vendors and companies to publish the results of their own emissions tests by actually determining what bias might come from their system, sort of like the mammogram example you had, to prove that their tools pass whatever standards are right for that industry. What do you all think of that?
Yeah, I wish this was the case in K-12. right, in special education. I wish there was regulation of AI. Why? Because we need some reference, right? We need a benchmark. Now, our benchmark are hundreds of thousands of clinicians and special educators who use intuition as their benchmark. There are no assessments. When you ask a speech pathologist, is this guy speaking any better than he was 4 months ago? The answer is, well, sounds like. Right? Now, how can you train a system based on this? How can you measure a system based on this? Add to this the fact that we are dealing with kids who have a huge variability in their speech and language, first of all, because they come from different cultures, and second, because they have a disorder. And if a child has a CP, a cerebral palsy, he's not going to speak correctly, he's not going to pronounce sounds correctly, that's the best he can do, right? Add to this the fact that AI, by design, is a moving target. How can you measure it as a black box when it changes every week? It learns from the hundreds of thousands of students. So I would love regulation to define how well we are doing and how well we measure and how well our scales that we have put in place, how correct they are. That's unfortunately not the case.
Yeah. And I'd like to kind of address what you just said. And as far as the regulation, and this is not just AI, but I think, AI, who gets to make the regulations? And I think this is the same problem we see like with the government and Congress. Like it's very well known that they have little background knowledge on any of the emerging technologies, yet they are passing all the laws and regulations that we have to, operate by. And then once again, I always go back, thinking, putting my educator hat on, if students and teachers and parents are not a part of the solutions or the regulations, then I still think you're going to get biased outcomes.
To connect a couple dots, one of the things it's worth noting about AI is that essentially what it is a prediction machine. You put in data and it makes a prediction about the future. We see this all the time. But a prediction is not a decision. So, for instance, you might check the weather. What's the likelihood that it will rain today in the afternoon? And the decision is, do I bring an umbrella with me? You still have to make the decision. And I think one of the things that we're touching on a little bit, and you hit on, Sergey, as well, as well as the ethical design piece, which is what questions are we asking AI to predict for us? Because even the best output of a poorly formulated question can be problematic. So for instance, in higher education, there's a lot of predictive analytics about student success. And this is an area, to answer your prior question, that we've not touched because it's a powder keg. And one of the questions is this student likely to succeed or fail? And given all the inputs, no matter what the label is, it is not a generous question to ask. In fact, if you are taking all the data from a very flawed system where people from the bottom income quartile in this country graduate college at a 9% rate, and people from historically resilient backgrounds also are performing below the national averages, you're going to get a biased output. That's never the right question to ask. Actually, a more generous question is, for anybody in any state, what is the best next step toward a successful outcome? That's a much more generous question to ask, and it's approximately an order of magnitude harder to answer. But it is the type of question that AI is approaching the ability to do exceptionally well, but it requires tremendous access to data, and I don't know any companies or schools that have the wherewithal, either the access to the data or the wherewithal with data science to be able to answer that question well today. But it is the type of question, I think, if we were to design a system from scratch rather than build the thing that is commercially viable, to build actually the thing that is most generous for the population it's serving. And I think that's what you're getting at, Ora, which is whose questions are we answering is really the crux of it.
That's great. All right, we're going to open it up to audience questions in about 2 minutes, so get your questions ready. And I have a little bit of a curveball to ask the panel because I haven't prepped you on this one before. But when you think about the applications of AI in education and workforce technology in the domains that you work with, where are areas in the future that you see there's real risk of bad outcomes and that you are already kind of priming your company to protect against, or trying to think about like how should we think about this future problem that's 1 to 5 years down the road?
Yeah, so the risk with AI is that it becomes an autonomous car, right? That's the risk. In education, you just cannot afford it. So what is, I think, the most important thing is, and that's the Joker card with AI in education, is using checks and balances with professionals who know their job, right? They're qualified, they're licensed, they are trained, and they are also trained on how to use AI as an augmenting feature, but not as a replacement. We will not allow that.
For me, actually, it's personalized learning, and I know everyone pushes the whole personalized learning, but since AI uses historical data, if you have students that are struggling, it will take a while before it learns like, oh, you're doing better. And that basically takes away choice from a student. So when I was in the classroom, I taught 8th grade science. A lot of the students I had were at the 3rd grade reading level, but I would never stop them just because of their standardized test scores if they wanted to try something that was beyond their prescribed level. And so I see that as a real problem of students being basically trapped in these cycles of remediation and not having the choice to learn at a higher level.
Sergey, what do you think?
Well, I recently left Turnitin, but I think they will soon have to deal with AI-assisted writing tools, for students. And I think that's going to be a set of interesting ethical questions, is like, how should we think about students using AI to potentially not learn as much as they should be learning, but still turn in work that's very impressive? We can choose to fight it and try to have an arms race of AI that can detect AI writing or other things like that. And then, AI systems that help students will improve and so on. Or potentially we can embrace it, like the calculator plays a role in math class, right? You can think of it as cheating if you define math as doing the algorithm by hand. But if you define math as solving problems that involve, numbers, then the calculator is a tool for it. So I think we're going to go through a shift where we'll change how we see AI when it assists students.
That's fascinating to me, because when calculators came into school, and maybe I'm dating myself, I thought it was definitely cheating. But over time, I've come to realize, no, we need to teach people how to use the power tools. And so now those power tools will be available and are available for writing in select circumstances, but it will scale very soon, actually. So does anybody in the audience have a question? If you do, raise your hand, and then I'll point to you, and you can stand up and kind of shout out your question. If not, I have a bank of follow-up questions. 3, 2, 1. So let's go to the bank of follow-up questions. And it's amazing with the audience room, with all the people standing in the back, that none of you have questions. I'm mostly saying that to the people that are online. But if Elon Musk was up here, he would say, you all are not paying attention to how dangerous AI could be. I run a self-driving car company, and it doesn't matter that for every 1,000,000 miles that the car drives, there's 0.001 incidents, but in the analog world, there's 4.4 incidents of an accident. There's going to be some type of regulation that's going to come clamping down on ed tech in the next 5 years. Lots of people think this. And so what should the industry be doing, or what are you all doing to try to get ahead of that, so there isn't some very possible law that says there will be no AI in classrooms, or there will be no AI used in hiring? That is not an impossibility. That is how politics often works in education. Yeah. Has that happened in China? I didn't know that. Like photo math, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Beijing is saying no, can't do that. And instantly the whole industry
Yeah, that could happen here too, if the industry just kind of assumes we can keep experimenting, we can keep doing, so what do you all think about that? What could or should the industry be doing to get ahead of that so that we don't get bad laws?
We could work together. That's one thing, and start regulating ourselves, or at least putting ethical practices in place. We're the, probably the least powerful people who could be making decisions like that. But getting ahead and instead of Facebook begging Congress to put regulations in place for its benefit, take the bull by the horns and do so ourselves. You have thoughts, Aura?
Yeah, that's literally what my organization is trying to do. We're facilitating and promoting AI literacy. So we need to educate students, but we also need to educate their parents and communities and schools and principals and administrators. And I think that's what doesn't happen too many times. We start this digital transformation, but we don't prepare the communities that will be adversely impacted. And so I think the AI literacy is really huge.
And we try to demystify AI. The reason that people are a bit threatened by AI is because it's a black box and who knows what's inside and what it can do. And when you drive a car, that's true. But in most cases, many AI companies I see have a 4x3 Excel, and that's their AI. They call it AI, but behind it is a model that maybe they have learned, maybe they've taught the system, but eventually it's a rule-based decision, a statistical model, and they just call it AI. And if you can open the box and demystify it and show that, yes, it does measure, it does understand, it does make reasonable decisions in several cases, then I assume that this kind of risk will not be met.
And there are some good examples of this in military applications, weaponized AI drones, which are terrifying. Companies have put moratoriums by a coalition to not put autonomous killing machines in the battlefield, which seems like something that doesn't affect most of our lives, but is at least a small example of a most extreme case of companies banding together and saying, no, this is a line we won't cross. So there's probably something around a Hippocratic oath in education, I could imagine, around AI usage.
It'll be the ethical choice to put autonomous machines in battle when the other side does it, though. Because you don't want to put humans against autonomous drones. You want to put your own autonomous drones against their autonomous drones. So it'll change what's ethical.
Yeah, in some senses, you can't possibly keep up. The regulation can't possibly keep up with the advances of the technology, and inevitably things will happen.
So, Sergey, are you suggesting to have AI students?
Yeah.
I would say we just took an interesting turn there.
Yeah.
So
but I like the framing of emissions testing.
Yeah.
So that was a cool contribution from Frida. Yeah, like you take your car in, it gets smog checked, and if it passes, then it passes. And if in the interim it breaks down, then society is willing to take that risk. I think it'll be somewhat similar for AI applications. Like if it passes the audit, then it's okay if it makes a mistake every now and then, because we've agreed that that's fine. Just like a speed limit, right? If we wanted all cars to be perfectly safe, the speed limit would be like 10 miles an hour. But we're okay with going faster on some roads because that's a trade-off we're willing to make.
interesting. So I have a thought I want to add here. I guess I'll use the moderator's privilege since we're down to the last minute, which is that part of why this question I think is so hard is because many education and workforce technology products don't have to go through something to demonstrate their efficacy in the first place. And having come from the foundation world, I worked at the Gates Foundation for a number of years and kind of got, I guess you could say, run through the gauntlet of thinking like an organization like the Gates Foundation, is that every product should have a clear theory of impact. Like if this product is used in this way, following this protocol, with this dosage, we expect to see these types of outcomes in terms of either student persistence or progression or score gains. And right now, many companies, I invest for a living. I work at New Markets Venture Partners. I invest in companies. Many companies don't even have that theory of exactly how their product should be used in the early days. By Series B or C, that does get developed. And so if you don't have a theory of impact about every version of your product or every function of your product, then it's hard to think about what the emissions testing should be for a good case. It wouldn't be emissions testing in this case, it would be the positive outcomes testing as well. So we have to kind of get our whole industry thinking about positive outcomes testing as well as emissions testing for this to work.
Agreed.
Amen to that.
Amen. Well, thank you, everybody.
Amen.
And we
Thank
appreciate
you.
you coming.
All right, thank you.